trying to align with.
In 2022, the Conversations on Food Justice series continued to provide a forum for rich, thought-provoking conversations on the ways that food intersects with race, class, and equity.
When we pray, when we read our scripture, and when we do our worship, that's about improving ourselves. When we feed others and help others, it's about changing society and seeing what effect our prayers and all of the knowledge we gained as people of faith, what effect it had. If we go to sleep at night and we haven't changed the world and made it a better place, we wasted a day. No problem. Get up tomorrow morning and do a better job.
And I think that is really the crux of it, that these challenges are systems-based, right? And so because they're systems-based, we don't always see them explicitly. And that's why I think the call to action is for us as consumers to be more critical, to ask questions about where does this food come from? How is the farmer being treated? You know, is it a local farmer? Am I willing to spend 5 more cents to buy a tomato that's locally grown from an immigrant family than to go to some other restaurant, other grocery store and have it be shipped here from Mexico? So those are the questions and decisions that I think consumers have to make.
I want folks to leave this call understanding that hunger doesn't look like what you think it does. And that framing that image of hunger, again, really limits us from seeing the full picture. So I would encourage folks on this call to really re-examine their assumptions and their picture around hunger and food insecurity.
The other thing that I will say to advocates that don't often get seats at that table, build your own table. Build your own table and bring people into your table and have those conversations and start writing your own pieces of work. Harness the media. Do what you can to get the information out there, because the conversations that we often hear are that people that live in poverty are lazy and they want handouts, but it's the total opposite. People that are in poverty, 9 times out of 10, already work. They already have 1, 2, maybe 3 jobs. They're doing the best that they can. And at the same time, they have to know public policy. They have to know policy and be policy experts for survival. And that is the one piece that people miss.
Thank you for being a part of our journey. We invite you to spread the word and share with your network the power of this series. We look forward to continuing the conversation with you in 2023.
Hello, everyone. My name is Elliot Gaskin, Senior Vice President of Development at Share Our Strength. And on behalf of my terrific colleagues at Share Our Strength and our great partners at Food and Society at the Aspen Institute, welcome to our Conversation on Food Justice first program of 2023. For those of you returning, thanks for continuing to be a part of our family. And for those joining us for the first time, thanks for spending time with us today. At a moment in our culture that at times can seem so divisive, we are proud to bring you conversations that seek to lift up justice, are thought-provoking, and that bring together a diversity of opinions that we can all learn from. As you listen to this conversation today, I challenge you to think about your own communities, the accessibility of food in your neighborhoods, and consider the reasons why what should be a right, access to affordable and healthy food for all, is not evenly distributed in our country. I hope you also listen and be a part of some of the solutions, as we have a group of panelists who are doing exceptional work across the country. Quick reminder, as always, in the last 20 minutes of this conversation, we'll be doing a Q&A. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat throughout, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. You can also select closed captioning and Spanish language interpretation via the language button. Thanks to our great friends at Community Language Cooperative for partnering with us again today. Now I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. We'll put their full bios in the chat so you can learn more about them and their work. First, our moderator, Ken Cobb. Ken is the professor and chair of the sociology department at Furman University. Welcome, Ken. Dr. Ashanté Reese, assistant professor of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Welcome, Ashanté. Dr. Dick Sadler, associate professor of public health, Michigan State University. Welcome, Dick. And the wonderful Keith Carr, senior policy and government relations manager, policy and systems at City Harvest. Thank you all for joining us for this conversation today. Ken, I want to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Elliot. I am really excited today. Dick and Ashanté, I have read your work. It has influenced me. I have cited your work. Keith, I know the work that you are doing is on the ground is what makes our research possible. And it is the action, which the theories that we are trying to hone is really meant to take part in and enact. So I'm going to get right into it. I'm going to start with a basic question of how you got interested in this topic. Everyone comes to the issues of food access, urban geography, built environment from their own history. So I'm going to start with Dick, and then we're going to go Ashanté and then Keith. Dick, could you tell us how you came to be interested in this work?
Sure. So I grew up in the Flint, Michigan area, kind of on the edge of an urban suburban lifestyle. Grew up going to a church in the city, played sports and did music there, but I went to school in a suburb, and I came to see suburbs as kind of awful places. I was the only kid that walked home from school. I had a grandparents that were a teacher and a former city councilor, and wondered, like, what are we doing out here in the suburbs? Why did you want this? I also played a lot of SimCity, and so I decided that focusing on urban development was important because we'd clearly not done a very good job of our cities in general in the late 20th century, and of course learned a lot about related issues of social justice later on. And I also grew up in a family that all of the grandparents and parents went to United Methodist Church, and I came to believe in social justice as paramount to dogma in terms of my values around that.
Okay, Ashanté.
Yeah, this is a great question. It's one of my favorite questions. So I didn't grow up in cities, even though I do most of my research at this point in cities. And I think, so that's the first thing for me. I grew up in a rural area, unincorporated area. Actually, that does not even show up on a map in terms of the name of where I grew up, in East Texas. And so when I went to college, it was the first time I lived in a city. And so I just became fascinated with how cities work. And then I taught middle school in Atlanta, Georgia, and that's the direct connection to food for me. It was the first time I was teaching students who had type 2 diabetes, for example, at 12 years old, which is something I was very ignorant about at that time. And so when I decided to go to graduate school, I picked up some of the questions that they asked me, like, why does your neighborhood have this great grocery store and we barely have any? I didn't have answers to those questions to them when I was teaching. And so that's what I decided to research.
Okay, thank you. And Keith?
Yeah, for me, I would say I've always been passionate about where food comes from and just keenly aware of food in wherever I lived. Like I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, but from my bio, you can say I spent my summers on my grandparents' farm. And I always wondered why. I mean, we were blessed to have the farm as a resource, but I always wondered why, like when we would go grocery shopping, we would drive like 2 towns over to a good grocery store. And I realized that the one grocery store that was in walking distance, and it still exists today, and it's still in the same horrible condition it was 40 years ago, and that was the only outlet for the north end of Hartford. And so fast forward to how I got involved in this work here. A friend of mine, he's a state senator here, and my sister was his chief of staff. And they wanted to start a youth farm stand. And she said, oh, we can get Keith to run it. I was consulting at the time and actually consulting for him on economic development. And he's like, what does Keith know about farming? And they said, well, we grew up on a farm, blah, 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 blah. And that's how I got into the whole conversation around food access and everything in Brooklyn and throughout greater New York. So it's just funny how this thing sort of connected. But it all started with, those summers back in East Windsor, Connecticut.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to start it off with just this discussion about the term food desert. It's come under a lot of criticism lately. This obscure term that kind of was actually coined in Scotland in the 1990s, came over here and became the engine for a whole agenda for research. So I've tracked this over time. Discussions about, should we call them food swamps, food mirages, everything. And so I'd like to get everyone's sort of perspective on the term food desert, as well as other terms or concepts that you think can help reframe this debate. Let's start with Ashanté, and then we'll go Keith and then Dick. Ashanté?
Yeah, thank you, Ken. I think people who follow me know that I really don't like the term food desert. And it's partially because there's this question about precision of language for me, which is, we talk about the way the term food desert is applied. You say it anywhere and people say, oh, no healthy food, fast foods, corner stores, no grocery stores. That's the kind of image that comes up. And I get really kind of taken aback by that, because when we think about actual deserts as, part of the natural landscape, deserts are teeming with life, even if we don't see them. And so in some ways, the metaphor is interesting, right? Because the things that people see are actually the things that I'm less interested in. I'm more interested in, like, how are people actually getting their needs met, right? But those aren't the things that come to mind when people talk about food desert. So my students in my classes, I often tell students there's lots of options for us. Even if we just talk about food access inequality, that's a clunky phrase, but it's pretty precise for the kinds of things that I'm talking about in the classes that I'm teaching. And then some people often ask about food apartheid. And, I think rightfully so, some of my colleagues in rural areas have said food apartheid doesn't really work for us in rural areas. And being someone who grew up in a town where there were only 2 grocery stores, I was like, I actually get that, right? But food apartheid, in the ways that it helps us think about process and think about how food access or lack of access is actually tied to process and not just this kind of phenomena that happens, process and policy, I think it can be really useful.
Okay, Keith?
Yeah, I agree. I don't use the term food desert at all. But I mean, if you look at an urban area like Brooklyn, New York, like all of New York City, there's plenty of food here. No matter how poor you are, you're surrounded by food. But is that food healthy? Is that food, like consumable and will not give you diabetes or hypertension? So to get to a grocery store, if there is one in your neighborhood, you walk past Chinese food restaurant, multiple fast food outlets, multiple fried chicken outlets, corner store after corner store with high fructose corn syrup laden, high sodium laden processed foods. So there's plenty of food here. But for people who want to eat healthy, this ties in sort of our role as a food bank in New York City. City Harvest is the largest food rescue organization, and we pride ourselves on really focusing on 60 to 70% of what we give to our food pantry partners is fresh fruits and vegetables. So at least those people who rely on emergency food have some access to some type of healthy foods. But so we really use the term more food swamp to describe the sort of the scenario that people see in urban areas. Like I said, I mean, there's the expression water everywhere, not a drop to drink. I mean, food everywhere, but 9 times out of 10, it's going to lead you to diabetes or hypertension. So, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, but a lot of our work in our nutrition education work, sort of works to combat the effects of living in this food swamp so people can sort of live a healthier life and thrive.
Okay. And Dick, your take on the term?
Yeah, I agree with both the panelists for sure, and appreciated Dr. Reese's characterization of food access inequalities, because certainly it's not the same for everyone. It's become shorthand for, an easy way to throw out a general term, but it definitely stigmatizes communities. And to one of the attendee questions about the language that we use that's perceived as good and bad, other words, even like jaywalkers, people who cross the street not at an intersection, is used to denigrate folks. And so absolutely, it just perpetuates some of these inequalities. One additional point that I had, though, or a thought that I had, is that even the study of these food access inequalities, or the shorthand of food deserts, even though it's inadequate, it's not studied as much in other countries. And I had the thought that sure, it was created in the idea was created in Scotland, and a lot of work in the UK about it. But fundamentally, when we talk about these food access inequalities, it boils down to the disinvestment patterns that the US has had, that a lot of other countries just haven't had to the same degree. Sure, maybe a country like Germany has its own struggles with racism and discrimination, inequality, but the way that the urban form is constructed in those other countries is very different. You have you still have supermarkets, but you have more localized food systems and smaller grocery stores, and there's healthy foods available in other places. And so when we, not that we want to keep using the term food deserts, but whether we're thinking about food deserts or food apartheid or food access inequalities, I think centering that it's in part a reflection of structural racism in our society and not an inevitability of urban development. Like, we don't have to have these patterns in our urban environment if we choose to build better cities and resolve this dysfunction in our society.
And Ken, if I might just,
Yeah.
I just wanted to,
Oh, sorry.
one more thing about what Dick said. I mean, it also shows, like in the United States, a disconnection between agriculture in this country. I mean, most European countries, South American countries, the family farmer, the local farmer is still an integral part of that food system. I mean, the grocery store has a relationship with them. I mean, the restaurants have a closer relationship with them than just more green markets in those areas. So I think it's also the disconnection between agriculture that makes for this sort of scarcity of healthy, fresh food.
Yeah, I was thinking about, thank you for that, Keith. I think that's a really important point. And I was thinking about what you were talking about, Dick, and so much of what happens in the US food system to me is a crisis of scale. There is this way that the food system, when we track the way grocery stores and supermarkets have developed over time, it's this increase, growing from something that was 3,000 square feet or less to these large mega stores that are now over 200,000 square feet, right? There's this question of scale. Where will we put these large mega stores? Why do we want them? All of these different things. And what gets lost to me, and how not just the food desert language, but how they have been studied, is that it's not often studied at multiple scales. So things like, how do we capture neighborhood markets, for example? How do we capture the quote unquote ethnic grocery stores that don't show up on the USDA ERS maps, right? These are the kinds of things that I think get lost because of our obsession with scale at this big macro level, which also loses the way people are making a way out of no way that could actually potentially be scaled up in policy, but often don't end up in policy, right? The way people live their daily lives, in my opinion, are the things that should be informing policy and often are not. We saw this, and we see this often, I think, in the kinds of debates that we have around food assistance. We've talked about this issue as a racial justice issue, and it is, but it is also an issue around class in this country and the way we treat poor people and the ways that we often are very paternalistic toward people who are poor. And again, these are kind of intimately tied to the ways we think about, we say access, but I think access becomes a shorthand for convenience. Who deserves convenient access and who doesn't?
Yeah, so what I'd like to do is, Dick, this next question is going to be for you, and just sort of the uniquely American aspects of this issue. And you, in your intro, you explained sort of growing up in the suburbs and understanding sort of how it was different than urban environments, and the legacy of housing and highway policy in the United States has shaped our food access today. I was recently just reading an article you did a couple of years ago about the concentration of liquor stores in some areas and not others, and how that's shaped by some of these policies. So one of the more uniquely American real estate practices that helped to reshape the urban environment is a concept called blockbusting. And you've used that in your work in relation to food access. Could you just explain what is blockbusting and how it relates to food access today?
Yeah, for sure. So we can't have blockbusting without redlining. And so redlining is the practice that before 1968 was legal to dictate where banks would lend money for homes, and had a very explicit racial bias. And so pretty much any minoritized community was in a redlined neighborhood. And so then after that was outlawed, blockbusting was this reaction where real estate agents saw neighborhoods that were near existing Black communities or other minoritized groups, and they would go up and down the street and specifically ask homeowners, they'd scare homeowners and kind of con them into selling their homes. And obviously a lot of these white homeowners were very eager to sell their homes to not live in an integrated neighborhood. But the effect that it had is that these neighborhoods would change 50, 60, 70% of their population within one census, like a decennial census period. So it's easy to see, looking at historical census data, where these neighborhoods were. They're often proximal to existing African-American neighborhoods. But the effect of it is that the massive suburbanization and relocation of white populations in the 60s, 70s, and 80s meant that those neighborhoods, in fact, may have changed more overall. So the cultural institutions, the churches, the schools changed dramatically. And at the same time, stores are getting bigger, they're abandoning their urban footprints and going out to the suburbs. So if we look at the criteria that big food retailers use, big tracts of greenfield land, they're near freeways, they're easy to get to by car, which reinforces auto dependency. All of these things kind of disqualify a lot of inner urban areas, the same places that were vacated by primarily white populations during the middle to late 20th century. And so, yeah, I did a study that's in the journal Spatial and Spatiotemporal Epidemiology, and we found that the neighborhoods in Baltimore with the poorest food access were in blockbusted neighborhoods. And this was a couple different measures that one of their local entities had constructed around food access. But it was blockbusted neighborhoods and not only redlined neighborhoods that experienced that the worst patterns of food access. And so if we are looking at a spatial version of access, and we want to look at food apartheid and inequality, looking at multiple forms of historical structural racism is essential. So not just redlining, but also blockbusting, and then also other things like urban renewal, freeway construction, restrictive covenants, exclusionary zoning, and then of course, gentrification.
Well, thank you for that. Just tracing past to present to see how our landscape have been forged by some of these policies of the past. But I want to take it to today with Ashanté. When I first read your book, Black Food Geographies, I was just so struck by the importance of a store. And we sometimes dismiss stores as like, that's just a place where you buy stuff, that's commercialism, that's materialism. But grocery stores or food access is different. I mean, we need food to live. And so I'd just like you to speak to the importance of the store, how the system is sort of stacked against smaller community-based stores in favor of the larger box store competitors on the periphery, and how just the availability or the type of store you live in can almost shape your life growing up.
Yeah, that's a great question. So a few years ago, I think it was 2018, there was an announcement that Kroger was going to be closing several stores in Memphis. And it was a big deal because Kroger has a near monopoly in Memphis, one, and two, the stores that they were closing weren't in the suburbs. They're kind of like outlying areas. They were closer in, and they were going to have an impact. And at the time, the retailer had said it was because of profitability or lack of profitability. They needed to close the stores. The city itself actually ended up doing a study and found that one of the two stores that had been slated to close, or they did eventually close, was actually profitable. So the question was like, why are we closing this store? So I guess I just wanted to kind of put a pin there around profitability being one of the big questions, big big box stores right now, it's often one of the top 3 reasons that are cited for closing a store or relocating a store or not citing a store somewhere. And even that can, not be as cut and dry as we think it is. So yeah, Black food geographies and looking at the ways people interact with stores, big box stores like Safeway, but also smaller stores like a community store that some people might call a corner store, which if we have time in the end, I think it would be nice for us to kind of think about language again, how things matter. So this smaller store I labeled a community store because it had been owned by the same family for several decades. They were residents of the neighborhood and they were super involved in the neighborhood. And so it became something that was bigger than just where people bought food. But it also became super significant for elders in the neighborhood. And I think sometimes with food access questions, there's a focus on youth and children and we forget about older people. And this store was really important because the store owner and one of the clerks who worked in there would just take a list from the elders, shop for them, come out, bring their bags back to their car, take the money. So they never had to, if they were sitting in a car, if they were sitting on a bench outside, they never had to walk around the store themselves. So that community, that's where the community aspect of those things come in. So in addition to just getting food, right? If someone's going to somewhere like a Safeway, the experience of shopping there matters as well. So the Safeway that I studied at the Center of Black Food Geographies was heavily policed. On any given day you walked in, there was a security guard at the door. There were several anti-theft measures in the store. We could talk about the pros and cons of all of that, but what it meant is that people were shopping in a heavily surveilled area, environment, and they didn't always feel good about that. So I guess I just wanted to add that nuance to it's not just where something is that matters to a community, it's also the experience they have when they are there. And whether or not their concerns are going to be heard, because often in this case in DC, at this store, community members did not feel their concerns were heard until there was a big expose about the quality of food at the Safeway.
Okay. Well, Ashanté, I'm not going to let you go just yet. Keith, I got a question for you in a second, but I really want to follow up on the terminology of corner stores. And I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So when I was doing my initial field work in DC, there were several of what we would call corner stores in this neighborhood. And I was very curious about them. I wanted to know who was going there. I especially wanted to know what kids' experiences were like there because lots of kids would go there after school. And so the initial store that I call Community Market in the book, I just thought of as another corner store. And by corner store, in my imagination, it was just small store, bars on the window, not a grocery store, go in, get quick snacks, whatever. But there were some specific things that distinguished the store that made me rethink the language. Some of it was, one, I needed to question my assumption around what a corner store looked like and what it meant. Two, this store, like a lot of small stores at this point in urban areas, was making an effort to carry fresh produce in the store. They were partnering with different organizations to do that, which for the sake of those that are listening, it's really hard for small stores to get fresh produce often because vendors are like, hey, we can go to the bigger store and we want to deal with the bigger store. There's a bigger volume here. And so it took a lot of effort for the store to do that. And again, this kind of community investment part was something that I was rethinking. And then I just started paying attention to more attention to what was actually on the shelves in the store. And I was like, wow, I guess I never really thought about this. And it made me rethink less of the language corner store itself, but more of the things we ascribe to corner stores in the negative way. Again, going back to the person who asked the question around good and bad, corner stores are often thought of as the bad. I think we could say the same thing about dollar stores and Dollar General. I mean, the last few years, dollar stores were in the news a lot around food access and such, right? So, this is more of an effort to really think about and question the dichotomy between good and bad and really judge something based on what is there and not what we think is there or not there.
Yeah, I know. That's just reconceptualize it. What do these stores mean? How do they come to attach we attach these meanings to them, and they have consequences. I'm going to bring it to you, Keith. Keith, I'd like to learn a little bit more about City Harvest. I'd like you to explain to us just kind of the scope of the services that you provide. I think most people, if you've signed on for this event, you're familiar with some of the things that you're doing, but if you could kind of give us an overview of the things that City Harvest is doing, but at the end, I'd like you to touch on the mobile market. I'd really like to learn a little bit more about that.
Sure. So like, as I mentioned, we're the city's largest food rescue organization, and we service a network of 400 soup kitchens and food pantries. And as I mentioned, our focus is really on bringing as much healthy produce, fruits and vegetables to them. But so besides the food delivery to our food pantry partners, we also have a nutrition education team, and we have a retail team that in the early days, we had a healthy neighborhoods program where we looked at specific neighborhoods around the city that had the highest prevalence of diet-related diseases, and with poor health outcomes, low access points to healthy food. And we did a lot of focused work on specific community districts to see if intentional investment into those communities, into the food landscape, would change things, change the health outcomes. And it did. The work was very successful. We worked with supermarkets, we worked with corner stores, bodegas, to get them to carry more fruits and vegetables, and worked with them on product placement and moving unhealthy things deeper into the aisle and moving healthier things up to the front, and at point of sale, having fruits and vegetables at point of sale instead of unhealthy things. And a lot of the stores that we work with really fully adopted the change and saw that they actually, at first they were reluctant. They said, no, I'm making a lot more money selling this. Selling candy and everything else. I said, but your markup will be higher on fruits and vegetables. So we had a produce whisperer that would go with them and sort of help them change the stores. And so I want to touch on something that Dr. Reese mentioned earlier. So a lot of our work was in Bedford-Stuyvesant. And in 1 year, as you've probably heard, gentrification in New York City, particularly in Brooklyn, has gone through the roof. And developers love those standalone big box grocery stores so they can build up, they get the air rights and everything to build up higher. And in 1 year, Bed-Stuy lost 4 grocery stores. And Bedford-Stuyvesant's only 3 square miles. So imagine how devastating that is to a community. But also what Dr. Reese was saying, these stores were anchors in the community. I mean, they hired kids for the summer. They charged people cell phones. I mean, they delivered groceries to their seniors. And like you said, they employed kids entrepreneurially minded children would go there and like, can I carry your bags out? Can I bring your bags to the car? So this was a devastating blow to a lot of those communities. And even though we rallied, one store, I hate to be too long, but one store is where not only I shop, but the state attorney general shopped, Hakeem Jeffries shopped, 2 assembly people shopped. So we held a town hall and got that store to be able to come back, work with the developer. But first they wanted to charge 4 times more with the lease, and we negotiated down to 2 times more. But still, once they were able to come back, they had a smaller footprint, which meant they had to charge more, which meant people were still in the same predicament, had a fancier boutique store had come there. So which brings back to gentrification, really sort of drives people closer and closer to that poverty line, especially the working poor, where they'll need emergency food. So we started these mobile markets. The goal was to have 2 in every borough. Right now we have 1 in Brooklyn, and then 1 in Staten Island, and then 2 in all the other boroughs, where we bring in, like thousands of pounds of fresh produce and vegetables and give it away for free in a farmer's market setting. And they're bi-weekly, and the community loves them. The community members come and volunteer, so they run the market themselves. We also started partnering with community partners to start another close to 30 community partner distributions all throughout the city in areas where we weren't working. And then because of COVID, we did a lot of pop-up emergency food distributions in areas that were affected, where we normally wouldn't do any program, but because of COVID and more people being out of work and more people being pushed closer to needing emergency food, we did pop-up distributions. Our emergency food distribution program grew. And even though we've offloaded many of those, community partners have stepped up to run some of those markets. And like I said, these are thousands and thousands of pounds of fresh produce going to these communities. But I always say that the effect of gentrification, there are those that if you aren't pushed out to move to another neighborhood, particularly those that live in public housing, you're trapped behind enemy lines. So you can't, the store that you used to go to no longer exists. The laundromat that you used to go to is now a luxury high rise. You don't have washer and dryer in your building. So now that's more and more of your budget now has to go towards either taking a cab to get the food, taking the bus to get to food. There's concerns about safety, traveling outside of your neighborhood or to a different part of your neighborhood to get food. So it really concentrates the effect of poverty when it comes to food access. And another thing, with the emergency SNAP allotments, I think you probably heard next month, early next month, the federal program that extended and increased SNAP allotments to families because of COVID, that's ending. So for a lot of families, that's going to mean going from an extra $250 a month in your food budget down to $90. If you're a single person or a senior, that may mean going down to $25. And a lot of these families aren't prepared for it. They may have been new to SNAP. The federal government hasn't really done a good job of getting the word out that this end is coming. So we're definitely going to see an increase in the need for emergency food. So right now, City Harvest and other food banks are preparing for what's going to be sort of a tsunami effect once these benefits end. But we're lobbying and advocating with our elected officials at the state level and federal level to get something in place to extend it.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the process you're describing, this new gentrification is sort of, it dovetails into the discussion earlier, whereas when Dick is explaining the housing and highway policies that pave the way to the suburb and drain these city centers of people and purchasing power, retail died and withered. And now that money and those people are coming back and they're reinvesting in these areas, new urbanist, mixed use developments, retail on the bottom, people up top, but at price points that the neighborhood residents who've been sort of sheltering in place for decades, waiting for that reinvestment to occur. But, it's reinvestment for whom? Is that new development going to benefit? Ashanté, did you have something?
Yeah, I actually wanted to, I know you're the moderator, but I wanted to, as Keith was talking, it occurred to me that sociologists in like the 70s and the 80s were predicting the death of cities. As and I wanted to hear a little bit from you around like the opposite impact that we're talking about, people returning, wealthier, often younger, whiter populations returning to cities. I'm wondering what your tribe, what sociologists are saying about this and how that relates to food retail.
Well, I can't speak for all sociologists, but I will say that, we looked at the suburban experiment as like fertile ground to try new policies, to reshape, to kind of start fresh. But the lesson learned was that, we had built cities in this country in ways that were pretty effective. They were dense, they were walkable. You had access to resources. They also came with a bunch of problems, but to try and refashion the urban built environment of the past with these kind of new expectations of requirements. For example, we have new dense development, but we still expect everybody to have a car or two cars. We have new expectations in terms of square footage per person. And the types of retail that we want, if you have a car, that shrinks the map and you can go access different kinds of food. But the walkable stuff that you want, yoga studios, cafes, those are other types of goods and services that don't necessarily aren't essential, but some people really want them. And so they can demand high dollars. So we're trying to sort of this recreation of our urban past, but in this bizarre new way that caters to really only the people who can afford it. So I don't know. Sociologists are generally pessimists to begin with. So I don't really know what the future holds, but it is it does require a point of reflection on, we got a lot of our planning ideas wrong in the past, and we're trying to fix those mistakes. And they were decades in the making and may take decades to fix. Derek, I'm going to throw this one next to you, and in terms of just to kind of follow up with these new urbanists, that what the planners are saying. I know you had you have done a lot of research on the built environment, and so is there anything that you've come across in your own research about what we can do to foster renewed investment in neighborhoods that had been divested, but don't unintentionally displace the same people that we're trying to help?
Yeah. Maybe a fundamental transformation in the way that we think about urban development and auto-based reliance in the US. Because like going back to the notion that in other countries, food systems look different, urban form looks different. But so, I mean, urban systems are connected to their food systems, but you can also catch a train to a small village in a lot of other places, or even a bus. And around here, our public transportation systems in Michigan are awful, and you basically have to own a car. And so when we think of urban redevelopment and we think of, walkable urban spaces, they get gobbled up by the highest bidder because they are attractive and we don't build enough of them. And if we fundamentally change the way we thought about cities, we absolutely need to reduce our reliance on the automobile. It's not sustainable. Even if we all drove electric vehicles, that's not sustainable, at least in Michigan. I mean, look at our potholes here. It's ridiculous. We have way too many roads. We're way too spread out. And the socio-spatial segregation that results perpetuates this pathology in the American urban system and American society, where we're so massively unequal. And so we would need to, rethink the way that everything in American society works, from taxation to land use planning to urban redevelopment. Because without that more fundamental transformation, designing equitable urban developments will keep going to the highest bidder. There certainly are things we can do, but it's a lot more difficult to replicate that, like design it for scale across urban regions, when we're only building so much new housing, and most of that new housing winds up, going to upper income groups. So I guess that's the I wouldn't call it pessimistic urban geographer, but the hyper realistic urban geographer perspective here. But I'm certainly looking forward to what Dr. Reese and Mr. Carr have to say about the other ideas around this, because for me, I just keep thinking like massive fundamental shifts in society are required to really take care of these inequalities.
Well,
Okay.
I'm sorry, can I respond to Dick?
Yes.
Yeah, because I'm not a real geographer, but I think I'm a play geographer. I'm not any more optimistic than you are on this point. But where I am optimistic, I think, is, so I think about what Ruth Wilson Gilmore says all the time, which is capitalism's job is to save capitalism. And if capitalism's job is to save capitalism, and we keep thinking about our big box stores as the center of our food system, then our imaginations are already too constrained. And so I think I agree a lot with what you're saying, Dick. I love when people ask me questions about solutions, and in my head, I'm like, we change everything. And no one wants to hear that, but that is actually fundamentally a part of what it means for us to think about what is something that is more sustainable and equitable. Because if we don't, we see from your work, I think we see from your work that capitalism's job is to save capitalism. And so then there are ways that it reinvents itself, And so I think one thing that people, I'm gonna use this term, and I'm not using it in a negative way. One thing that foodies get right is this interest in like drawing from the past, wanting to slow things down, wanting to savor. And I think that there is some usefulness in thinking about and learning from how past more sustainable ways of building cities or spaces, because I think we can question if cities are the best ways for us to even think about space and place. But that's another kind of conversation. But how we design space and place in a way that is really around values. Like I was writing this piece the other day about the idea of scarcity. We talk about scarcity as if it's not manufactured. It is totally a manufactured phenomena. And if we can manufacture scarcity, for me, the question is, how do we manufacture abundance? And that's what I've been trying to study, like with people, community groups, et cetera. So I think it takes us all. There are people who are doing the policy work, who are doing, the kind of trying to reimagine and rethink how we do public policy, urban planning, all those things. And then there are the activists who are out there who are really trying to imagine how do we rethink land ownership, which I think is a big part of this, right? How do we rethink what it means for us to share? How do we take more of the food from the market economy and put it more in kind of like gift exchange, non-market economy kind of thing? So I guess those are a lot of the ways I think about this these days are less about policy and more around like, what are people doing kind of outside of the eye of policy, and how do we grow more of that?
Okay. Well, we've got some awesome questions coming in the chat. And so I want to make sure that we sort of expand the net and make sure everyone gets to hear issues that are important to them. Of course, we're going to have a question related to COVID. And so this is, the question is, how have work from home policies or the work from home movement, how will that affect urban centers and food access? If you think of most American cities were built around work, and we had this coupling of you had to live where you worked. And now we're slowly starting to decouple that. Now, that has different implications for people in different class strata, but it's a trend. So I'd like to open the floor up if anyone has any thoughts about how the work from home movement may affect food access debates or solutions moving forward.
Yeah, well, I guess in the very beginning of the pandemic, we saw, the immediate effect was that the supply chain couldn't keep up. More people working from home means that more people are cooking for themselves and cooking at home. I talked to a few store owners, and literally the truck would unload, they'd stock the shelves, and because of the shortage of the tractor trailer drivers, et cetera, there weren't enough trucks to keep bringing food to the large box stores. So we saw empty shelves, and then obviously people were hoarding. But for the population that we serve, it's to cook more meals at home costs a lot more money, and which is why the need for emergency food, peaked in 2020. We rescued and delivered. We were forecasted to rescue and deliver 68 million pounds, and over the course of 2020. We rescued and delivered close to 250 million pounds of fruit and produce, which was, I don't know how we did it. We didn't add any more trucks. We didn't add any more employees. And half of us were working at home, and operations staff were working in the warehouse, but we got it done. But it really shows that, that especially when the schools closed, the need for people to have more subsidies. We're happy that the federal government stepped in with pandemic EBT, as well as giving free meals, using schools as distribution centers as free meals, so your child and yourself could go there and pick up food, even though the school was closed. But the need for emergency food just really skyrocketed, and it just really shows the need for the community to be more involved in where their food comes from and how it's prepared, et cetera, and for people to be more sovereign when it comes to their food decisions. A lot of the policies that we're working on outside of hunger policy is really around urban agriculture, boosting urban agriculture so people have more agency as to where their food comes from, increasing urban ag tech so it creates jobs for people that are the demographic that we serve, as well as the creation of more worker-owned food co-ops. So a lot of those areas where gentrification says that you're going to have more of these fancy green markets, but no, we can have a worker-owned co-op that is there for the community and employs people from the community, as well as the creation of local food hubs that will create jobs at the local level, but also bring more food closer into the community so that these shortages and supply chain issues don't really affect the urban areas that we serve. And I already mentioned the SNAP, the things, the advocacy we're doing for SNAP.
Yeah. Ashanté, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, just quickly, this is less about the work from home part of that question and more about the pandemic part of that question. So I guess it was last year, the Economic Research Service published a study about hunger during the pandemic, saying that, like, you know, basically we did a good job of feeding people during the pandemic, that the levels overall had not changed in hunger in the US. But when you looked at the data more closely, what was also true is that for Black and Hispanic households in the US, the amount of food insecurity did increase, as did the amount of food insecurity in the US South. And so I guess I am just pointing that out there because there's also a few other questions around emergency food provisions and all of these different things, that the regional differences and the racial differences in what food insecurity and hunger look like are important, and they were exacerbated during the pandemic.
Yeah, we have another question in the chat here that I think relates, and I'd like to address it. It is that the stigma around these efforts to nutritional support for SNAP, WIC, EBT, sort of blaming the poor for their poverty, making them jump through hoops. And so I'm just wondering if any of you have seen new policies or programs on your radar that can help reduce some of the stigma behind providing nutritional support that people just one of their basic needs, that can make accessing those benefits more dignified and equitable.
We're really on our end, we're really just advocating that the Department of Social Services just makes it more user friendly. At the height of the pandemic, a lot of the district offices where you would go to apply closed, and they didn't really have a strong sort of technological way to. There were no apps. There were no. I mean, everything was in person, so they had to really sort of shift to see how they could do things in a virtual way. But I think until the people that look at people who receive these benefits with scrutiny, until they realize that it's more and more really the working poor, the disappearing middle class. And one thing, if we could end hunger, I know the White House Conference on Hunger was back in September and everyone was really excited about it. But if this country would really want to end the stigma around hunger and really end hunger, all they have to do is increase the federal poverty guidelines. Right now, for a family of three, it's about, depending on where you live, $21,000 to $23,000 a year, which no one could survive on. I mean, a college student couldn't survive on that. So if they increase that, and as well as the average median income, more people would be able to qualify for affordable housing, but more people would also be able to qualify for food stamps. But it's really about the cost of what the true cost of living is wherever you live, and really looking at self-sufficiency standards in your communities. In New York, we did our self-sufficiency standard study last year, and it really showed that a family of three in the Bronx needs about $70,000 plus to thrive. And because, as I mentioned earlier, if your grocery store closed, now you have to travel to the grocery store. If your laundromat is gone, now you have the expense of that. And just if you have children in school, that's different amounts of car fare to take one child to school, take another one to daycare. So if you're making in New York City, the minimum wage is $15 an hour, that gets eaten up quickly, and people sacrifice eating what they want. And is it healthy to make sure their rent is paid and make sure your kids have what they need for school and make sure you can get back and forth to work. So you sacrifice what you put on your table. So, I mean, just simple things like changing poverty guideline of average median income, as well as the built environment of making sure that, I mean, they're the same way we have business improvement zones, we should have healthy eating zones or affordable eating zones where there's access to healthy, affordable food in every community. And that's sort of Candidian of me to think of But I mean, that's, if a city really wants to make itself a healthier place to eat and thrive, we can create these healthy eating zones.
Exactly. Okay, we're going to do one last question. I'm going to hand this over to Dick, and then we're going to do a quick update, go around the circle, and let us know what you're up to next. Dick, it looks like you got a fan in the Q&A here. It said they love it when you said "when we choose." And so these are the policies that we've chosen in the past. So the question is, how do we, activists, change makers, nonprofits, gardeners, et cetera, encourage planners to rewire their brains a bit to make the choice to include food systems in master plans or sector plans?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a big lift, right? Because we built a lot in the mid-century that was, had a lot of structural racism baked into it. So undoing everything we built from 1946 to the present day, it's a lot. So a colleague of mine, Cami Patacucci, is at Wayne State University. She wrote a good paper years ago on food systems being a stranger to the planning field because, like the real estate industry, it's mostly a private system. It's not transportation, it's not water infrastructure, it's not education. I do think there's some growth and recognition of this, though. I mean, certainly, like from my experience here in Flint, our master plan does have food systems baked into it. But I think that there's an even bigger gap in the implementation for this. So funding for community food systems and equitable redevelopment, and also a hurdle that we face in terms of engaging folks in the food system who maybe don't want to be engaged in the food system. Kind of this issue of, in communities like Flint where there's so much disinvestment and there is this role for a localized community food system in addressing food security, but it's also demanding a lot of folks who already live in these places. So I would say that, it is getting baked into these master plans more than in the past, but we still need to be able to convert that, these policies into action. That's where I would think a lot of our effort should be focused.
Okay. So we're getting close. I'm keeping my eye on the clock here. We're just going to kind of go around the horn and just give everybody a chance to provide a quick update on what you're up to, what's next on your agenda, things that you're working on, new things that you see on the horizon. And then, we'll take it from there. So Ashanté, you're going to go first. Keith, you'll be next, and then Dick, you'll finish us off.
Okay. Thanks again, Ken, for corralling us and keeping us moving. I really appreciate it. So what am I working on? Someone asked in the Q&A about the piece that I mentioned on scarcity and abundance. It'll run today or tomorrow on MLK 50, which is a local journalism organization in Memphis. So you can Google it, it'll come up at some point. So I'm working on 2 books. One book is about sugar and carcerality. So I'm looking at the ways carceral logics have flowed through how we talk about sugar, how sugar is produced, but also how we talk about sugar in relation to Black people's bodies in particular. And then I'm also working on a second book about gathering, which is kind of loosely built on the premise: in the face of racial violence, Black people have always gathered, and food is often at the center of that. And so what does that look like? So those are the 2 big projects I have going on right now.
Okay, and Keith?
Yeah, on my end, like I said, really a lot of advocacy around this emergency SNAP allotment that's going to end, as well as through our coalition work, food co-ops, urban agriculture, so people have more sovereignty where their food comes from, and then also with our New York State budget. Just really advocating for more funding for fantastic programs like there's a program called Nourish New York that connects New York State farmers to downstate or to food banks all across the entire state. And this came as a result of, at the height of the pandemic, farmers were tilling their produce over because because restaurants were closed. They lost their main customer base. So we saw the images of farmers pouring milk down this gutter and food being tilled over. So Nourish helped save a lot of farms upstate, and it was really a benefit to the local food banks. So just advocate for more healthier options.
Okay, and Dick, why don't you finish this out?
Sure. Yeah. So Flint, I've mentioned, is my hometown. A lot of my research is here. And so in general, my work is rewarding, but I'm particularly excited. Michigan's legislature turned for the first time in more than 20 years, and I think to a more pro-urban and pro-social justice tack. So I'm excited about the opportunity to convert more of my research into practice. I also just submitted 2 big research grants to the NIH. They're called RO1s. Aimed at studying this idea of structural racism in the built environment. I've been abbreviating it Strasse, like the German word for street, so STRABE. The one on the context of unequal aging in the context of living in these places, and the other looking at cross-city comparisons of health and economic development outcomes based on how much structural racism in the built environment has occurred in different neighborhoods in different cities across the US. So I'm really hoping this work can add meaningfully to the research base on this important topic.
Okay. Well, thank you all. I mean, I've followed you all, and I read your work a lot in the prep for this, but I learned a lot, and so this was really fascinating. I mean, the stuff that y'all are open to, it's just there's so much knowledge, and it just gives me hope. So the pessimistic sociology in me has been lifted up a little bit. So thank you. I am now going to hand this off to Corby Coomer, the Executive Director for the Food and Society Program at the Aspen Institute.
Hello. What a great conversation today. And we've never had more attendance and never had more Q&A. So thank you, Ken. Thank you, all of our panelists, Dick Sadler, Ashanté, Reese, and Keith Carr, for a really terrific conversation. It will be videoed and online and available, and our very large audience will be even increased once it's available, which will be as of next week. Lots of appreciation to our interpreter, Elizabeth Lara of Community Language Cooperative, and all thanks to our partners in Conversations on Food Justice and Share Our Strength, No Kid Hungry. You heard from Elliot Gaskins at the beginning, but you didn't hear from Julie McNulty, who does the most incredible conceiving research, fantastic prep for everybody, and they're a joy to work with. So we're coming back in April, an exciting virtual session covering water access, and in May, we'll have our second in-person event in New York City. Please join our email list, follow us on social media, and when we announce date, topics, and panelists, you'll be the first to know. Thank you to all. We look forward to seeing you again in our next conversation on food justice.